I hope you all are doing well in this strange week between Christmas and New Year's. I'm excited because I've been thinking heavily about this little show, modest as it is, and I have a few different improvements that I'm going to throw at you guys this evening. I'm going to be going a little bit longer than I have in the past. You guys can let me know what you think. Stay tuned as long as you can. Come back later and tell me in the comments what you have in mind, and we'll see what happens. We'll see where we go. I don't think I want to do segments throughout the day like Timcast did, but I do like the idea of making it a little bit longer so that I can engage with you guys a little bit more. I'm going to try to stay focused on the positive as I have been. I've been considering naming this Silver Linings with Sour Patch Lids. Obviously, I haven't made that plunge yet, but I do think that would be a neat idea to kind of keep us focused on what's good in the world. There are a lot of shows out there that focus really heavily on everything that's bad in the world, and I find that to be counterproductive because if we're going to try to actually make some real change, we need to focus on what's possible and what we can accomplish, and that requires positivity in both instances. So as we get started, we're going to keep focused on that, and then we're going to see where that leads us. And you guys can once again let me know what you think in the comments and in the chats. I'm going to keep a close eye on any super chats that come in, try to make sure I don't miss anything. And I do have a little bit of a plan tonight, so we're going to go through the Twitter leak, or the Twitter leaks, the ongoing slow leak. The latest edition is from a journalist called Dave Zweig. I believe is how his last name is pronounced. It's a little weird. Let's see here. He is writing over with Barry Weiss over on the Free Press, thefp.com. That's, I think, a kind of Substack where they can kind of say what they are really thinking, which is awesome. This is a little bit of a long article, but it's worth it to go through just because it is the latest episode of what exactly Twitter was up to. Elon Musk was right about it being like a crime scene. He had no idea what he's getting into. Honestly, good for him sticking out as long as he has. I'm just hoping that he finds somebody good to take his place as CEO, since we now know that that's something that might happen. Hopefully he picks somebody who's really good faith and really focused on doing what's right for free speech and for humanity, as Elon Musk would put it. Because I think he's right. I think this is something that's really important. Twitter really makes a difference to the cultural conversation. So let me see if I can switch over to reading successfully. Okay, you can see my laptop a little bit. I have to move that. Well, let me see how I can do this. There we go. Okay, good. There's my little guy. This helps me identify my laptop, so you guys can enjoy him with me. All right, so this article is from, as I said before, the Free Press for free people. Today is, in fact, Tuesday, December 27th, 2022. And this article is called How Twitter Rigged the COVID Debate. And it's a very interesting thread. So I hope that you guys will stick with me as we go through it. By the time reporter Dave Zweig got to the 10th floor conference room at Twitter headquarters on Market Street in San Francisco, the story of the Twitter files was already international news. Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Leighton Woodhouse, Abigail Schreier, Lee Fong, and I had revealed evidence of hidden blacklists of Twitter users. The way Twitter acted as a kind of FBI subsidiary and how company executives rewrote the platform's policies on the fly to accommodate political bias and pressure. What we had yet to crack was the story of COVID. David has spent 3 years reporting on COVID, specifically the underlying science or lack thereof behind many of our nation's policies. For years, he had noticed and criticized a bias not only on the mainstream media's coverage of the pandemic, but also in the way it was presented on platforms like Twitter. We couldn't think of anyone better to tackle this story. BW, that would be Barry Weiss, who I believe is the editor-in-chief over there at the Free Press. So buckle up. It's going to be a bit of an article. I think it's going to be worth it. If it gets to be too long, we'll go to the end and catch the summary. You guys should also check out his Twitter thread. I don't remember his @ Let me see if I have it here. I was looking up Solzhenitsyn. David Zweig. Yep. David Zweig. That's his handle on Twitter. If you guys want to follow him, he has 83,000 followers. Criminally low. Well, let's read more about what he discovered because it really was interesting. I'd always thought a primary job of the press was to be, oh, excuse me, this is so annoying. I don't want to update. I'd always thought a primary job of the press was to be skeptical of power, especially the power of the government. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, I and so many others found that the legacy media had shown itself to be largely operate as a messaging platform for our public health institutions. Those institutions operated in near total lockstep, in part by purging internal dissidents and discrediting outside experts. Twitter became an essential alternative. It was a place where those with public health expertise and perspective at odds with official policy could air their views, and where curious citizens could find such information. This often included other countries' responses to COVID that differed dramatically from our own. But it quickly became clear that Twitter also seemed to promote content that reinforced the establishment narrative and to suppress views and even scientific evidence that ran to the contrary. Was I imagining things? Was the pattern I and others witnessed proof of purposeful intent? An algorithm gone rogue, or something else? In other words, when it came to COVID and the information shared on a service used by hundreds of millions of people, what exactly was being amplified? And what was being banned or censored? So when the Free Press asked if I would go to Twitter to peek behind the curtain, I took the first flight out of New York. Here's what I found. Oh boy, this is getting spicy already. The United States government pressured Twitter to elevate certain content and suppress other content about COVID-19 and the pandemic. Wow, that's a strong opening statement. Let's read more. Internal emails that I viewed at Twitter showed that both the Trump and Biden administrations directly pressed Twitter executives to moderate the platform's content according to the wishes. So this is something interesting that I noticed in the earlier leak. The Trump administration also did this. So this isn't really something that you can say is divided along party lines. It happened for both of them, and neither party is innocent. I wish there were clear-cut good guys and bad guys. Hopefully he will explain what exactly the Trump White House wanted to restrict and how successful they were with it. I'm willing to bet that Twitter wasn't very pleased to be working with them, but I digress. Let's read more. At the onset of the pandemic, the Trump administration was especially concerned about panic buying and sought help from the tech companies to combat misinformation, according to emails sent by Twitter employees in the wake of meetings with the White House. One area of so-called misinformation runs on grocery stores. The trouble is that it wasn't misinformation. There actually were runs on goods. Yeah, I remember that. And it wasn't just Twitter. The meetings with the Trump White House were also attended by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and others. When the Biden administration took over, its agenda for the American people can be summed up as be very afraid of COVID and do exactly what we say to stay safe. Interesting. I like Dave's take already. In July 2021, then U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released a 22-page advisory concerning what the World Health Organization referred to as an infodemic and called on social media platforms to do more to shut down misinformation. We are asking them to step up, Murthy said. We can't wait longer for them to take aggressive action. That's the message the White House had already taken directly to Twitter executives in private channels. One of the Biden administration's first meeting requests was about COVID, with a focus on anti-vaxxer accounts, according to a meeting summary by Lauren Culbertson, Twitter's head of U.S. public policy. They were especially concerned about Alex Berenson, a journalist skeptical of lockdowns and mRNA vaccines, who had hundreds of thousands of followers on the platform. So here we see this little screenshot that says one of the first meeting requests from the Biden White House was about the COVID misinformation. Per regular process, public policy took the meeting. Biden's staff focused on vaccines and high-profile anti-vaxxer accounts, including Alex Berenson. By summer 2021, the day after Murthy's memo, Biden announced publicly that social media companies were, quote, killing people, close quote, by allowing misinformation about vaccines. Just hours later, Twitter locked Berenson out of his account and then permanently suspended him in the next month. Berenson sued Twitter. He ultimately settled with the company and is now back on the platform. As part of the lawsuit, Twitter was compelled to provide certain internal communications. They revealed that the White House had directly met with Twitter employees and pressured them to take action on Berenson. So this is the government of the United States pressuring a private company to take action against a private citizen. That's really something. This is not something that the Trump administration ever did, to my knowledge, but we'll double check on that. I want to be fully fair, and I do think that both parties are truly guilty of trying to use social media against citizens. The summary of meetings by Culbertson, emailed to colleagues in December 2022, adds new evidence of the White House's pressure campaign and illustrated how it tried to directly influence what content was allowed on Twitter. Culbertson wrote that the Biden team was very angry that Twitter had not been more aggressive in deplatforming multiple accounts. They wanted Twitter to do more. This is a really interesting screenshot here. The Biden team was not satisfied with Twitter's enforcement approach as they wanted Twitter to do more and to deplatform several accounts. Because of this dissatisfaction, we were asked to join several other calls. They were very angry in nature. Really interesting to see how emotional the entire Biden administration was about Twitter as a platform. I cannot imagine that the Biden administration is very happy that all these likes are coming out of Twitter. This is really not a good look. Like, I don't care what the end result is. I don't care if they ever get punished. Well, I obviously do care, but it doesn't matter if they ever get punished. They cannot be comfortable with this. This doesn't look good. This has got to be damaging their reputation at least a little bit, if it's possible to do so more than it already has been. Twitter executives did not fully capitulate to the Biden team's wishes. This is very interesting. Yoel Roth actually has a protagonist role here. So let's read on. An extensive review of internal communications at the company revealed that employees often debated moderation cases in great detail and with more care for free speech than was shown by the government. That is really interesting, right? But Twitter did suppress views, and not just those of journalists like Berenson. Many medical and public health professionals who expressed perspectives or even cited findings from accredited academic journals that conflicted with official positions were also targeted. As a result, legitimate findings and questions about our COVID policies and their consequences went missing. That's very dangerous. That's not a place that you want to be. You always want more conversation. More conversation is better. More conversation is what you want, especially when you're facing something confusing, intimidating, and scary like COVID. There were 3 serious problems with Twitter's process. First, much of the content moderation on COVID, to say nothing of other contentious subjects, was conducted by bots trained on machine learning and AI. I spent hours discussing the systems with an engineer and with an executive who had been at the company for more than a year before Musk's takeover. They explained the process in basic terms. Initially, the bots were fed information to train them on what to look for, but their searches would become more refined over time, both as they scanned the platform and as they were manually updated with additional chosen inputs. This is my understanding of AI as well, at least as it pertains to social media platforms. At least that was the premise. Though impressive in their engineering, the bots would prove too crude for such nuanced work. Interesting. When you drag a digital trawler across a social media platform, you're not just catching cheap fish, you're going to snag dolphins along the way. Interesting analogy. Second, contractors operating in places like the Philippines were also moderating content. They were given decision trees to aid in the process, but tasking non-experts to adjudicate tweets on complex topics like myocarditis and mask efficacy data was destined for a significant error rate. Yeah, no kidding. The notion that remote workers sitting in distant cube farms were going to police medical misinformation to this granular degree is absurd on its face. Embedded below is an example template deactivated after Musk's arrival of the decision tree tool that contractors used. The contractor would run through a series of questions, each with a drop-down menu, ultimately guiding them to a predetermined conclusion. So let's see if we can make this bigger. I don't think we can. Yeah, we can't. And I can barely see it. My computer's too far away. Let me see if I can fix this. There we go. Is the claim about any of the following topics? The COVID-19 misleading information policy has been discontinued. Okay, so they discontinued the COVID misinformation policy. I remember that. What kind of message is being advanced regarding this topic? Specifically, what is being said? What is the author's position? Interesting. Recommended tweet level remediation. Where does the misinformation reside? An additional recommended remediation. Interesting. Third, most importantly, the buck stopped with higher level employees at Twitter. They chose the inputs for bots and decision trees. They determined suspensions. And as is the case with all people and institutions, there was both individual and collective bias. Of course there was. At Twitter, COVID-related bias spent heavily toward establishment dogmas. That's not surprising at all. This is like asking a fish if water is wet. Fish don't know they're wet. People who work at Twitter don't know they're left-leaning. Inevitably, dissident yet legitimate content was labeled as misinformation, and the accounts of doctors and others were suspended both for tweeting opinions and demonstrably true information. Take, for example, Martin Kulldorff, an epidemiologist at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kulldorff often tweeted views at odds with the U.S. public health authorities and the American left, the political affiliation of nearly the entire staff of Twitter. What did I say about fish not knowing they're wet? Here is one such tweet from March 15th, 2021 regarding vaccination. Someone asked him this question. Dr. Kulldorff, do you think younger age groups and or people who already had the virus need to be vaccinated? I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I am vaccine hesitant about this one. It seems to be a religious mantra now that everyone must be vaccinated. That's a very good observation from this random anonymous Twitter account, Endemic Equilibrium. And Martin responds, no, thinking that everyone must be vaccinated is as scientifically flawed as thinking that nobody should. COVID vaccines are important for older, high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with prior natural infection do not need it, nor children. Fascinating. This is actually my reasoning for not getting the vaccination, because I had COVID. And the effects were not fun because I lost my sense of smell and taste. But at the end of the day, I was like, hey, I already have it. I got a natural immunity. I don't see a need for inoculating myself against something I already contracted, Internal emails show an intent to action by a Twitter moderator saying Kulldorff's tweet violated the company's COVID-19 misinformation policy and claimed he shared, quote, false information. Hi team, sending a heads up that we will take action on Martin Kulldorff, a professor of Harvard Medical School, for violating our COVID-19 misinformation policy, specifically by sharing false information regarding the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, which goes against CDC guidelines. That's fascinating because there is no explanation of what exactly he said that it was incorrect. And they noticed that he was a professor of epidemiology, which is the study of epidemics, which is exactly what COVID-19 was. He was a professor of this subject at Harvard. This is not a community college professor. This is not an adjunct professor. This is an actual professor from an actually incredibly respected medical school. And they're saying, we know better than you. We're adhering to what the CDC says. You're wrong. You're dissident. You're going against the rules. You're transgressive. But Kulldorff's statement was an expert's opinion, one that happened to be in line with vaccine policies in numerous other countries. Yet it was deemed false information by Twitter moderators merely because it differed from CDC guidelines. After Twitter took action, Kulldorff's tweet was slapped with a misleading label and all replies and likes were shut off, throttling the tweet's ability to be seen and shared by others, a core function of the platform. I hate it when you see those tweets that are so restricted that you can't interact with them at all. I always retweet them, or I'll take a screenshot and link back to the original person because I'm like, clearly something's being said here that needs to be heard because this platform doesn't want you to see it. They don't want you to hear it. And to me, that says there must be something there. This is exactly the reason that Andy was so suspicious of all the stuff that was going on. He was like, if you can't even dissent, there's something going on. Something is wrong there that they can't even entertain an alternative viewpoint without shutting you down, which I completely agree. I 100%. And that's one of the biggest roles of freedom of speech. You must be able to dissent. You must be able to disagree. You have to be able to argue. And this means that both sides have to be able to defend their viewpoints, which is something that the left is sorely lacking. This is why my piece that I keep referencing, but I feel like I need to revamp it because I wrote a piece about how being a conservative is good for your mental health because it forces you to clarify your own views, to go back through them and make sure that they're holding water, that they're able to be defended, and that it makes sense to you on an ongoing basis, whereas leftists have this ability because they own all the institutions to just set it and forget it. When it comes to their own views, they're never asked to defend what they are originally thinking. So this creates a weakness in them. It makes conservatives, it makes conservatives intrinsically stronger because they're constantly required to face what's kind of like a knife sharpening type, like a rock tumbler kind of situation, where they're constantly being pushed to polish and refine and restate these ideas in ways that other people might find compelling, because it's not taken for granted that they're correct, as it is on the left. But I digress. Let's continue. In my review of internal files, I found numerous instances of tweets about vaccines and pandemic policies labeled as misleading or taken down entirely, sometimes triggering account suspension simply because they veered from CDC guidance or differed from establishment views. For example, a tweet by Kelly KGA, a self-proclaimed public health fact-checker with more than 18,000 followers, was flagged as misleading and replies and likes disabled for showing that COVID was not the leading cause of death in children, even though it cited the CDC's own data. Here she is saying, what an excellent example of cherry picking if you narrow it down to only the specific months you specify, which includes the largest COVID wave seen across the world, and you ignore all non-disease deaths, and you ignore cancer, heart disease, SIDS, then COVID is, quote, leading. And again, she's using the CDC's information. This is actually, I was going to pull this article up too. This is actually something that Ted Lieu, I think he's a representative from probably California or somewhere over there on the West Coast. He said that COVID was a leading cause of death among children. This is something the CDC has clearly disproven. This is something that is not true. And Elon Musk actually went in and fact-checked him. He ended up deleting his tweet. So interesting that this particular topic came up because he was trying to make the case that it wasn't disinformation, that kids actually were dying of this at a greater rate. I always say that Ted Lieu is working very hard to disprove that unkind stereotype that Asian people are smart, because everything he says seems to be like it's utterly deficient. I don't know what he's thinking when he tweets. It's possible he doesn't handle his own Twitter account, in which case I would say he definitely needs to fire the people behind it, because his takes are not right. They're just not right. They're so consistently wrong as to be like outrageous, almost like he's trolling. Internal records showed that a bot had flagged the tweet and that it received many tattles, what the system amusingly called reports from users. That triggered a manual review by a human who, despite the tweet showing actual CDC data, nevertheless labeled it misleading. Tellingly, the tweet by Kelly that was labeled misleading was a reply to a tweet that contained actual misinformation. Here's a person who says, since December 2021, COVID has been the leading cause of death from disease in children. And that's pretty much exactly what Ted Lieu was saying as well. COVID has never been the leading cause of death from disease in children. Yet the tweet not only remains on the platform, it is without any sort of misleading label. Isn't that fascinating? Whether by humans or algorithms, content that was contrarian but true, and the people who conveyed that content were still subject to getting flagged and suppressed. Sometimes this was done covertly, as reported earlier by the Free Press. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a Stanford professor of health policy who argued for focused protection of the vulnerable and an end to lockdowns, was secretly put on a trends blacklist. Yeah, I believe that's called the Great Barrington Declaration, was this idea that we really just needed to protect the most vulnerable from COVID-19 and everybody else could go back to work. I ultimately fully agree with that. I've never understood the idea, first of all, that, for example, the governor of New York or the governor of Michigan would put sick people into nursing homes full of old people who are at risk from all kinds of diseases, not just COVID-19, but also that very much so. Incredibly distressing. So it never made sense to me that we wouldn't just, for example, lock down the nursing home. I know that would be hard. It'd be very, very difficult. And I even thought at the time you could have older people who are like, you know what, I'm okay with possibly contracting COVID-19, and others who are like, absolutely not, I don't want it. I always thought we should have given them that autonomy to say, hey, I'm okay with this. I feel like I'm at the end of my life anyway. It's more important to me to be able to see my family. And then you should have the older people who are like, no, I absolutely don't want it. I want nothing to do with it. And or there are powers of attorney. And then the people who are okay with catching it could go to a different nursing home that was more open. And the people who are not okay with catching it would remain in a more enclosed nursing home, ultimately restricted from like family members and outside influences. Very sad idea, but it could have kept them healthier for longer. But the way we did it, absolutely no sense. The fact that New York put sick people in these nursing homes, absolutely disgusting. Like I constantly am thinking of Janice Dean, whose in-laws both died in a nursing home because of Governor Andrew Cuomo's decision to put COVID positive patients into nursing homes. Like literally the most vulnerable populations were put at risk by these insane blue state policies. But once again, I digress. Many instances were public facing. The author of the tweet embedded below is a physician who runs the infectious disease ethics Twitter account. The tweet was labeled as misleading, even though it was referring to the results of a peer-reviewed study that found an association between the mRNA vaccines and cardiac arrests in young people in Israel. Below, the first study I've seen showing that mRNA vaccines in young people ages 16 to 39, excuse me, I'm giving myself the hiccups, are associated with cardiac arrests, not just myocarditis. First vaccine dose, second vaccine dose, cardiac arrests, and COVID cases. Very interesting. Andrew Bostrom, a Rhode Island physician, was permanently suspended from Twitter after receiving multiple strikes for misinformation. One of his strikes was for a tweet referencing the results from a peer-reviewed study that found deterioration in sperm concentration and total motile count in sperm donors following mRNA vaccinations. Wow. The more I learn about this, the more I'm like, I'm so glad that I didn't get this. So glad my husband didn't get it. Really, really grateful that we were in a position where we could stick to our guns and refuse this, because this is just not something that I think people our age need, and I don't think it ever was. Twitter's logs revealed that an internal audit conducted by Twitter after Bostrom's attorney contacted the company found that only one of Bostrom's 5 violations were valid. The one Bostrom tweet, found to still be in violation of Twitter policy, cited data and drew a conclusion that was totally legitimate. The problem was only that it was inconvenient to the public health establishment's narrative about the relative risks of flu versus COVID in children. And nothing could possibly surprise me less that the health administration, or that the public health establishment and the big government were right on hand to make sure that big tech was doing their bidding. This tweet was flagged not only by a bot, but also manually by a human being, which goes a long way to illuminate both the algorithmic and human biases at Twitter. It seems grossly unfair, Bostrom told me when I called to share with him my findings. What's the remedy? What am I supposed to do? His account was restored along with a number of others on Christmas Day. Another example of human bias run amok was the reaction to the below tweet by then President Trump. Okay, so now we're getting into the Donald Trump thing. So this is not just the public health establishment. This is the government, and this is people who simply motivated by political ideology. It's this. We're getting back to Jim Baker. This really gets wild. Here's what Trump had to say about having COVID. Many Trump tweets led to extensive internal debate at the company, and this one was no different. I don't know if you guys remember this one. I will be leaving the Great Walter Reed Medical Center today at 6:30 p.m. Feeling really good! ! Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed, under the Trump administration, some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago. And I think there's enough in this tweet to make both sides of the aisle unhappy, because Donald Trump was here saying, hey, you know what? Don't be afraid. Don't let this dominate your life. Stay positive. I think he had every right to say that. In fact, I think that's exactly what a strong leader would do, would be to project this era of positivity and this idea that we're going to be fine, we're going to get through this, we are Americans after all, we're the smartest, we have the best scientists, whatever. I want everyone to remember that Trump came up with Operation Warp Speed and this vaccine. So I want all the credit where it's due. I want it from left-wingers who push everyone to get vaccinated, and I want it from Trump supporters who are vehemently anti-COVID vaccine. Trump came up with this. But I don't believe that Trump ever said or ever condoned the idea of it being mandatory. So I will put that in place. I just want people to remember that about the COVID vaccine. This is the best part. In a surreal exchange, Jim Baker, at the time Twitter's deputy general counsel, asks why telling people not to be afraid wasn't a violation of Twitter's COVID-19 misinformation policy. And I think what Yoel Roth had to say in return was exactly right. Exactly right. Here we see from Jim Baker to Yoel Roth and Stasia Cardile, I believe. Why isn't this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID-19 policy, especially the don't be afraid of COVID statement? Thanks, period. Jim, how passive-aggressive can you be? In his reply, Yoel Roth, Twitter's former head of trust and safety, had to explain that optimism wasn't misinformation, and I do think he deserves credit for this, even though I have a terrible opinion of him. Hey, Jim, adding you to the main thread on the subject, so I'm assuming there was a Slack thread about this. In short, this tweet is a broad, optimistic statement. It doesn't incite people to do something harmful, nor does it recommend against taking precautions or following mask directives or other guidelines. It doesn't fall within the published scope of our policies. Curious whether you have a different read on it, though. I'm sensing a great deal of passivity in this thread, which I find hilarious, and I think they deserve it, all of it. Remember Kelly KGA with the CDC data tweet? Twitter's response to her in an exchange about why her tweet was labeled as misleading is clarifying. We will prioritize review and labeling of content that could lead to increased exposure or transmission. What does Twitter think they are? They're supposed to be a platform. And I think by this point, we are so far departed from the concept of Twitter as just a platform as to be like, it's far in the distance. We're waving it goodbye. There's no going back there. Throughout the pandemic, Twitter repeatedly propped up the official government line that prioritizing mitigation over other concerns was the best approach to the pandemic. Information that challenged that view, for example, that pointed out the low risk children faced from the virus or that raised questions about vaccine safety or effectiveness, was subject to moderation and suppression. This isn't simply the story of the power of big tech or of the legacy press to shape our debate, though it is most certainly that. In the end, it is equally the story of children across the country who are prevented from attending school, especially kids from underprivileged backgrounds who are now miles behind their more well-off peers in math and English. It is the story of the people who died alone. It's the story of the small businesses that shuttered. It's even the story of the perpetually masked 20-year-olds in the heart of San Francisco for whom there has never been a return to normal. If Twitter had allowed the kind of open forum for debate it claimed to believe in, could any of this have turned out differently? Wow, wow, wow. This is an excellent article by Dave Zweig. I firmly recommend following him for his scoops and for his writing at the Free Press, which is Barry Weiss's publication. Bravo to him. I found his writing to be really, really good. I found it to be really interesting, captivating almost, I would say. I love writing and I really appreciate well done writing. He had such an important story to tell, and I think that his story was written in such a way that it truly brought people in and made sure that they were fully paying attention. Let's see what you guys are saying. We're going to take a quick break here and then we're going to switch gears and talk about something entirely different. Let's see here what we got. I'm going to have to adjust this a little bit. Okay. Lids from Caper2X. Thank you, Caper. Another take. Nothing done during Trump's administration was done by the GOP. Yes, but here we have his tweet bragging about coming up with Operation Warp Speed's result, which was the vaccine. So I think we can fully place that at his feet since he's more than willing to take responsibility for it. And then Caper goes on to say, but as part of the fifth column, deep state maneuvers to sabotage him and conservatives prior why can't I see the rest of this? Prior to 2020, still persisted until Elon took over. I think you're right. Elon Musk has certainly been a breath of fresh air because he's brought such a different perspective that we really haven't seen. And again, I'll say it again, I really think that Elon Musk is the Donald Trump of big tech because he came in and he's like, all right, I'm going to do all this stuff. And I think he was likely heavily inspired by Donald Trump just marching into the White House and being like, all right, we're going to fix all this stuff. He wasn't able to do that because he wasn't fully clued into how deep the deep state is, the permanent state, the administrative state, if you will, all of those middle management type people who make life hard, horrible, and miserable for us poor normal people. But you may have a point. I know there's such a fifth column, and this is what I was talking about, how all of the institutions are fully controlled by by the left. And this makes it very easy for them to be like, oh yeah, there's no other way of thinking than what we have. Let's see what else you guys are thinking. Hey, Linda. Hello. Hey, hi. How's it going? Glad Lids is up and streaming. I'm back to work and it's nice to wind down with familiar streams. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Yesterday, I actually completely spaced it. It didn't even occur to me that it was a Monday. I guess I was kind of thrown by Christmas also being on a Sunday. It was just too many different factors for me. And we were visiting friends in the evening anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. Ahoy, Lids. Ahoy. Good evening, Lids. Howdy. How's it going? There are two sides. The people versus the feds. I'm inclined to agree. Yoel Roth has a protagonist role. Talk about some soap opera level life imitating art. It is very interesting. Yeah. So, like I read, the most recent thing we read, where Yoel Roth was like, actually, optimism doesn't violate our terms and conditions or whatever. Don't get me wrong. I think Yoel Roth was wrong about so much other stuff, and clearly a dyed-in-the-wool leftist. But the fact that he was even arguing for any form of free speech was, I was pretty proud of him. I was happy for him. Lots of people saying that Ted Lieu could use a little more brains. I'm inclined to agree. By the way, it is my birthday. What a wait to celebrate 67 years. However, as an RN, I found the WHO and later CDC statement suspicious. And once again, it is the cover-up that always gets them. Yes. Happy birthday, Caper. Thank you for spending it with us. I love it when people spend their birthdays with us. I think I have family members' birthdays coming up soon. And today marks 4 years since I got my ink. I actually got my ink to celebrate losing a bunch of weight, and I'm about to do it again, so might have to get some more after that. Adrian Curry says, normal, who here identifies as such? Winky face. Absolutely no one. No one here, no one in this chat should identify as normal in any way. I completely agree. Nice to see you, Adrian. Hope you had a nice Christmas. Trumpkins are dumb, still defending him even when he has done all the things they whine about from Biden. So I don't think they're dumb. I think that they were really hoping that Donald Trump would put an end to all of this, as we can see all this deep state madness. But yeah, I do think it bears repeating that he put Operation Warp Speed into effect, and admittedly, he wasn't going to mandate the vaccine. Under his administration, I think there was a lot more pushback than there would be from underneath the Biden administration. But anyway, I digress. I just think it bears remembering that Operation Warp Speed was Trump's baby. All right, it's time for us to move to our next topic, because this is a good one. I am excited about this one. This is actually some really good news. So we're actually getting into some silver lining stuff here. An honorable mention to my news site of the evening, because I bought a whole bunch of articles from them. This is Just the News. This is journalist John Solomon's baby. And they do great work over there. And we have a few different articles from them. Let me shrink it down a bit. Supreme Court hands border states a big win. Orders Title 42 to remain in place during legal challenge. Thank goodness. Title 42 is an order allowing border authorities to swiftly deport migrants if they hail from a country known to host a communicable disease such as COVID-19. The Supreme Court on Tuesday ordered that a COVID-19 era immigration policy remain in place. Title 42 is an order allowing border authorities to swiftly deport migrants if they hail from a country known to host a communicable disease like COVID-19. Border officials have deported an estimated 2.5 million migrants under the order since its implementation. Wow, that's great. Honestly, I think that we need something more permanent, though. COVID-19 is not a good enough excuse to be like, okay, I'm sorry you can't illegally migrate to this country. We need something permanent. We actually need a solution. And I am not alone in thinking this. Something like 2/3 of people, so 2/3 of registered voters want to send more law enforcement and military to the border, says a poll. 3/4 of Americans believe illegal immigration is bad for the country, while exact percentage thinks legal migration is good. I'm not sure about that headline. Americans overwhelmingly favor immigration as long as it's legal. 100%. I love the idea of immigration, and yes, it has to be legal, which I've always thought means we need to overhaul the way we legally migrate. I have known many people who legally migrated from the Philippines, from Mexico, and who complained constantly about how long it took to get through the process. It's hard, it's horrible, and all of these people were working very hard at the time. I know this because I literally worked with them. They would pick up extra shifts constantly, and they were always driving back and forth between Denver and my hometown of Colorado Springs. They had to go back and forth for immigration stuff. It just seemed like such a hassle. And I know how daunting that can be to somebody who's trying to build their own American dream. I really believe that the people who come here and want to work hard and want to make the American dream their own really are like, they're truly exemplary. And I think that we need more of them for sure. And our country can certainly benefit from these hard workers. As far as like a great replacement, aka like Chuck Schumer was mentioning the other day, where he said, oh, we're actually not having enough kids, therefore we must have more migrants. I think that it's really unfair and frankly dishonest for the left to be like, oh, they're espousing this white supremacist idea of a great replacement, when Chuck Schumer literally got up in there and said, yeah, we're not having enough kids, we need more migrants. That's exactly what we're going for. And he really kind of said the quiet part out loud there. It's so clearly not the far right saying this. It's so clearly not even the right wing really saying that there is a kind of replacement. I remember seeing an article title about the browning of America and how positive that was. And I was like, this is literally like the great replacement theory. Like, you really want this to be the case. You don't want white Americans to be in a majority anymore. And I don't know what to tell you. This is just something that they've been pushing, but they're doing that thing where they're saying, you're wrong for noticing this. This is something Ben Shapiro noticed. He's like, the issue isn't that the thing exists. The issue is that you're noticing that the thing exists. And the more I think about that, the more I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what's happening here. I don't think that is something that we should let pass without paying attention to it. That's really something that's going to become more common. But anyway, yes, a huge majority of registered voters do want more law enforcement and military at the border. I haven't read what's happening in Arizona with those shipping containers that they were using to form a kind of makeshift border wall. I actually thought that was kind of an interesting and good idea. I imagine those would be hard to get over. Not impossible, but difficult, and certainly big enough and wide enough to present something of an obstacle at these heavy traffic places. I find myself so frustrated that the people who call themselves the most compassionate are apparently the most willing to put up with human trafficking, drug smuggling, with the cartel being empowered by all this money that people are giving them to be coyotes across the desert for them. People are dying. People are being sexually abused. Young people, children, people are ending up in places they shouldn't be. People are dying in the desert because we are trying to make it so that people can come to this country illegally. If we had a system where people could come legally with relative ease, there would be no incentive for the cartel. We could seriously undercut the biggest crime syndicate in the West. I think that's fair to say that the Mexican cartel is that, because at this point, Mexico itself is I forget what they call it. They call it like a narco state, like narcotics, because they're trafficking a lot of this stuff. Obviously, it's the number one export of Mexico at this point, and every single person in the government, I'm hearing stories about how people in the police stations are being bribed by different branches of the cartel, and it's brutal, it's vicious, it's really, really bad, and I feel terrible for everyone who has to live in Mexico. But the fact is, illegal immigration empowers the cartel. It's literally giving them money to break our laws, and it's just disgusting, disturbing. When Joe Biden was asked if he would be going down to the border, he said he had more important things to do, and frankly, I don't think that you could look anyone in the face who lives in any one of these border states and honestly say, you know what, I don't think this is really that important. Because if you had a shred of decency, you'd be like, oh, this is actually affecting the way people live. This is affecting actual homeless people down there who then aren't able to get the resources that maybe they would be able to receive otherwise if it weren't for illegal migrants. I saw that they shipped migrants to Kamala Harris's home in DC, and I'm not convinced that's the right play, but it definitely does bring attention to it. And I think that it might be something that needs to happen going forward, just to keep them at the front of mind, as Karine Jean-Pierre likes to say. We'll keep those migrants at front of mind because it's very important. It's clearly something that's important to the poor plebs who live down on the border, not so much to the politicians in DC, and they could do with some reminding. I just thought it was interesting. I was very happy that Title 42 was held up in court, in the Supreme Court specifically, and I think that We do definitely need some more permanent solutions, and I don't think that what we have now is in any way workable. And it's so clear to me that the Democratic establishment has no desire to actually make positive changes. So, all right, let's see what you guys are saying now. I'm curious what you guys think about immigration. It's such an important topic and something that we don't really discuss enough, I think. We're all just kind of like, yeah, illegal migration is bad. Well, yeah, how are we going to come up with a solution for it? Are we going to actually find a good way to help people defend against the cartel? Are we going to find a good way for people to push back on the narco state that has become Mexico? Are we going to help the Mexican people by making sure that the cartel has less power over them? So many different choices. There are so many different things that the U.S. could do better that we're choosing not to for reasons I don't fully understand. In summary, I will say this. I know that the Democrats wanted to bring these migrants in so that they could have like the extra representation in states like California. But at the end of the day, I don't think they fully understand exactly how conservative these migrants are. These migrants are coming from heavily Catholic places. They're coming from places where they care about their families. They take care of their old people. They care about their kids. They discipline their children in ways that Americans don't even anymore. And it's kind of amusing, darkly, to me to think, what if Democrats charged in and told all of these migrant parents that, for example, their child would be exposed to disgusting, depraved adult content books in school? How do you think a Latino mother would feel about her child being told that her child is identifying by a different set of pronouns now? How do you think Latino and Latina people feel about being called Latinx? I will tell you right now that the only Latino people who are okay with this designation are the ones who have attended U.S. colleges. It's almost comedic to me how they figured that these people would be continuing to vote for them as they drift further and further left. I don't think it's going to work the way they thought it would. It will give them more representation, and they will be able to convince them to vote for them by giving them things, because no one is immune to that kind of thing. But I don't think that they're going to be able to undermine Hispanic values successfully and still get their vote. Anyway, I digress. I just thought that was interesting because they are so conservative. Let's see what you guys are saying. Here's another super chat from John Cordisco's Corner. Any tips on how channels like yours and mine are suppressed? Tried other websites. YouTube is where the action is. Be well and God bless. Yeah, so YouTube's kind of interesting. One of the things that Scott Adams noticed on a recent stream was that the ones that got demonetized for him were the ones that had swearing, which is kind of interesting. Kind of tells me that YouTube really does want you to be family friendly as much as possible. And I think that's fair, because one of the reasons, well, probably one of the ways we were able to maintain our monetized status on YouTube when I was over at Timcast was making sure that we were family friendly. And it wasn't just so we would stay in YouTube's good graces. We really did want to be on good terms with families who had kids and who were like listening to us as they were putting their kids to bed or whatever. And I think that that's a good rule of thumb. Make sure you're not swearing, use word of mouth, talk to your audience. I think that's probably one of the best ways to go. I personally find that the most meaningful, but then again, my goal isn't to have 1 million subscribers per se. It's to make a difference to one person. Like today's Caper's birthday. I think that's awesome. Really glad they're spending their birthday with us. I don't even know if they're male or female. It doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter on YouTube. Like, it literally doesn't matter. We're happy to have you guys here. And I think that if you can make one difference to one person, maybe like once a day, then that's enough of a reason to keep doing it. So another thing you can do too is start to upload your podcast to other platforms, which is something I'm going to be working on in this coming year. I would really like to have my stuff be on podcast platforms, and then you guys can listen while you're doing other stuff. I know I personally love listening to podcasts while I'm doing chores. I'm constantly listening to podcasts at 1.5 speed. Listening to Ben Shapiro at 1.5 speed is really like you took some kind of upper and it's making you really, really hyper. It's actually kind of invigorating, so I kind of enjoy it. For sure. Let's see what you guys have to say. Adrian says, I say Americans start invading Canadian borders in solidarity with illegal aliens at our southern border. Yeah, but who really wants to go to Canada at this point, honestly. Truth bombs lids. Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm just curious how the whole actual conservative Hispanics are going to react to being told that their child is no longer, their son or their daughter. They're the opposite gender. I don't think these parents are going to like that. I keep saying they're going to try to trans the wrong person's kid one of these days, and I think it's true. Somebody points out, yep, St. Miles says even the Muslims were upset by it 100%. See, there are things that these people of religious persuasion have in common. This is actually our next topic. We're going to talk a little bit about Christianity going forward. And we'll close with something a little less uplifting. But I wanted to talk about Christianity because you're right that Muslims were going in and they were protesting. And I remember they tried to pretend, the mainstream media tried to pretend that these bigoted Christians were misleading these poor gullible Muslims and making them dislike, for example, propaganda that promoted the LGBTQ agenda. There's no place less friendly to the LGBTQ agenda than the Middle East, right? I feel like everybody has to know that at this point. I feel like we all know what the punishment is under Islam for being homosexual. And I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying they take their faith extremely seriously, and they are what people would probably call fundamentalists when it comes to that. They follow the law to the letter. They follow it extremely legalistically. That's what I would have called it during my time and my upbringing in the Christian church. And there are rules in the Bible that are extremely harsh, and Christianity is truly entirely redeemed by the presence of Jesus, because he functionally rewrote. I'm not a theologian, so I'll just say this in passing, but Jesus rewrote the law and gave a form of redemption to people who needed it. He brought grace instead of rules, and he brought a great amount of forgiveness for the people who are willing to get away from their sins and to forego that stuff. People talk all the time about how, I keep seeing these ridiculously woke takes about how Jesus probably would have been hanging out with queer people. Okay, first of all, Jesus did hang out with prostitutes and tax collectors, the worst of the worst at the time. And what he said to the prostitutes and to the tax collectors was that they were sinning and that they should stop doing that. And yeah, honestly, if you want to quote Jesus at me, fine, I'll quote him right back at you because I have that background. And you don't even necessarily have to believe it. You just have to know the facts about Jesus to know that he hung out with people who actually were marginalized, people who actually were victims. And in our current day and age, the LGBTQ alphabet crowd is not marginalized. They are not victims. And Jesus might have hung out with them, possibly just to tell them to stop acting out of depravity and letting them know that he cared about them, even though they were sinners, as we all are. I think that Christians tend to place more of an emphasis on certain sins over others. I was always kind of amused to see that Christians didn't really talk much about gluttony. There was a lot of big eating in the Christian church, especially in the Deep South. There's such a community. I understand and I appreciate the community aspect, but there's a heavy emphasis on overeating, because so much of that communication is done around like potlucks at church and with meals with family and all that good stuff. And I wish that there were more of an emphasis on all 7 of the sins equally. I think pride is just as bad as sloth, is just as bad as, greed and lust and all this stuff. But anyway, so we're talking about the religious faith aspect of things, and I think this article from Just the News is really interesting, and I don't think that people in the U.S. think it can ever happen here, but it really bears consideration. Christians face genocide amid rise in persecution in at least 18 countries, report warns. In Africa, extremism threatens previously strong Christian communities, the report states. Christians are facing genocide in several countries as the persecution of followers of the religion has increased in at least 18 nations, according to recent research. The Catholic group Aid to the Church in Need released a report earlier this year titled Persecuted and Forgotten, a report on Christians oppressed for their faith 2020 through 2022, which highlighted human rights violations against Christians in 24 countries. The group found that persecution increased in 75% of the countries surveyed. Wow. In Africa, extremism threatens previously strong Christian communities, the report states. In Nigeria and other countries, this violence clearly passes the threshold of genocide. The report also found that Christians are experiencing genocide in Ethiopia's Tigray region and in North Korea. Yeah, North Korea, that makes sense because when you have communism, you cannot have another religion. The state is your religion. There is no room for another leader other than dear leader. Religious nationalism and authoritarianism intensified problems for the faithful, including the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan, which prompted Christians and other minorities to attempt a desperate scramble to escape. Christians are not only killed, but in some areas they're detained on blasphemy charges or kidnapped and forced into marriages, the report found. The suffering church needs people to speak out for us, said the Reverend Andrew Adeniyi Abayomi wrote in the report. Okay, I cannot handle that name. I'm sorry about that. Please forgive me. This was very interesting to me because I really respect and admire. Some of my biggest heroes are people who survived concentration camps. Okay, so we're talking Corrie ten Boom, we're talking Viktor Frankl, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. All of these people, Corrie ten Boom was a very religious person who survived with great faith. Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn both observed that the people who were able to withstand this kind of ridiculous pressure the best, the people who never lost faith, the people who were constantly focused on what was ahead, what was above, were the people who had highly held religious beliefs. And I firmly believe that having a religion like this is so crucial to making it through hard times. Now, admittedly, it can make your life a little bit harder, but if you truly believe that there is something bigger than you, there is someone who truly, deeply, dearly loves you, who created you in his image, and that you are doing the right thing by holding on to your faith, I find that to be incredibly meaningful. And this is why people from the Bible times till now are unwilling to let go of their faith. As far as I'm concerned, having your own faith is a very, very basic human right and something that these countries absolutely must respect. And there is a reason that it is in our Constitution that the state shall make no law imposing some kind of state religion on the people. This is something that's so fundamental that I think that Americans have been able to forget it. This is actually something that my parents used to talk to us about often. They used to say, there are Christians in the world who are suffering for what they believe. We are very lucky, and I don't think you guys know how lucky we are that we aren't facing a similar kind of persecution. But what's happened to the American church in absence of persecution is it has grown incredibly weak. People are wandering away from the church, and this is always the case. This is like the fundamental difficulty of being a human. Without hardship to drive you on, without something to push you forward, away from, and towards, you're going to drift. You're going to get weak. You become passive. And this is part of the reason they say hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. It is the cycle. And I truly, genuinely believe, and I don't know why this is. You guys are welcome to commiserate with me on this one for sure. I don't know why it is that humans require hardship to truly get stronger. It's like without actual hardship to get stronger against, we're put in a position where we need, for example, a gym, or we need like a married relationship to keep us on our toes. We need something that's pushing against us in a kind of rock tumbler fashion to make sure that we're being held to someone else's standard, whether it's our spouses or church leaderships or a personal trainer. We need someone to put us in our place and to give us a perspective that we lack. There is something about humanity that says, when I have my own way, everything's going my own way, I don't care about anything, I'm going to allow myself to get weak and soft or to get bored, even worse. And that's not to say that this kind of persecution is a good thing, but the fact of the matter is that without hardship, to some degree, obviously there is some kind of ideal level of hardship that people can face, where it's hard but not impossible, where you won't die for your faith, but you will be questioned and you will have to think ahead. I know we complain about being a conservative in a country that's functionally run by leftism, but the fact of the matter is without that pushback, without that hardship, our views would become as lax and as weak, and we would be as quick to block and as quick to hide away as the left is now. This is a positive. So I think if I could leave with one silver lining here, it's just to say that A hardship is something that we're never going to escape. It's something that we have to work in tandem with, and it absolutely is not something that we can live without. I know there is a tendency to say, I just want things to be easy. I just want to go along to get along. That's never going to happen. It's always going to be difficult, and that's a good thing. I know you might think I'm crazy, but at the same time, you can look at it where you don't have adversity, you do have weakness. Where you do have adversity, you have strength. It's required of you, and you can and you will rise to the occasion when you're put in a situation where everything isn't going your way. I had one more topic I wanted to cover tonight, but we're right at an hour, so I think I'll save it for another day. It's not exactly timely, just talking about how Generation Z wants mental health, and yes, they do want mental health. They want mental health days at work. And I wanted to kind of open that conversation and see what we think is going to happen with that, because it's kind of an interesting topic. I could see both sides of it. You guys are welcome to disagree with me. I know that times are hard. There's a tendency on my part. I'll use this as a teaser for tomorrow. How about that? For my part, it's easy to say things are easier now than they ever have been before. We have absolutely no excuses. But the fact of the matter is, life is still hard. Life is hard for humans, no matter where we are, no matter where we go. And this kind of lines up with what I was saying earlier about adversity. It's going to be difficult. It always is. And it doesn't matter if it's because we have to walk 500 miles for our water or not, or if the difficulty is really just that people don't understand where we're coming from and we don't feel heard and we're lonely like people do in our modern environment. Just because you don't have to catch your own food doesn't mean that life isn't still hard in different ways. And I think it's fair to say Gen Z, who wants mental health days at work, they might have a point. So we'll get into that tomorrow for sure. All right, let's read this last super chat from St. Miles. When you can, see if you can read and review the book Creating a Life Worth Living by Rabbi Manis Friedman. Would be interested in your view on it. That might be super fun to do for sure. I still love the idea of doing a book club, but we were talking to a guy about it at church, and he was mentioning that there's a tendency for people to just be like, they'll just let you read it, and then you're the only one who's read it, and nobody else is really getting anything out of it. So I like the idea of having like some study questions or something we could do for a book group, and then we'd need to figure out when we want to do that, when we would want to do it. I know that Andy's super busy. I work in the morning and producing Making the Argument over at the Making the Argument YouTube channel with Nick Freitas. We had a super cool episode that's going to go up later on this evening where we go through and we talked about all the coolest questions that he was asked at his live events this year, and we're going to do more super fun, super cool episodes where we're fully engaged with making the conservative argument and how important that is for our modern world. So I feel like I've definitely gone on long enough. We did successfully do an hour. Thank you guys all for joining, especially you, Adrian. Love you. Mental illness days. Yes, no, that's not what I meant. And she says, man up. Sure. But at the same time, I think that there's something to it. We can get into it tomorrow. Definitely think about that today. This is a slightly older article. I think it's from May 6th, 2022 or something like that. And it's on Forbes. So definitely check that out. That's your homework for tomorrow. We're going to come back to it later. We'll see what other big news comes out tomorrow, and we will talk about all of that good stuff then. Once again, thank you guys all so much for joining. I love you, Lyd, says Adrian. Oh, I love you too, Adrian. We do appreciate you, crazy Montana lady. The Chaldeans fled and set up their community in Michigan because they were targeted by Muslims for being Christian. Now some Muslims are trying to take it over. There's always going to be conflict. There will always be conflict between religions. That's just the way it is. I know that a lot of this genocidal mania against Christians in other countries is because of that too. And I don't know what to say about that except that it's not right, and it's always going to be the case. And those two things are so often with each other. It's not right, and it's always going to happen. And I don't know how to make that better except to say that it will make you stronger. And I think that knowing that truth is the ultimate point that I can leave you guys with tonight. I'm going to go get some food, and then Andy's going to go rollerblade. Thank you guys again so much for joining me. Until next time, I will see you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.